All right, welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we are going to take a deep dive into a term that we all know, like we all have heard it. We all know it from like movies, music. It's
Yeah.
gold digger.
Yeah.
And the material you shared was really fascinating, like a lot of historical context, legal stuff, even pop culture. I mean, it's everywhere. So we're going to try to
Yeah.
unpack all that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those terms that, like, on the surface, it seems very, very simple. But then once you start to actually dig into it, you find out that it unlocks so much about just like societal anxieties and the power dynamics within society, especially when you start to think about like money and gender, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
Okay, so let's start with the basics then. When we say gold digger, like what are we actually talking about? What is that, like, what is that term?
So I think the general understanding is that a gold digger is someone who enters into a relationship, a sexual relationship specifically, primarily for financial gain,
Okay.
and not for love. And historically, it's almost always been a woman. And then if that leads to marriage, that marriage is often seen as this kind of like transactional thing, like a marriage of convenience based on like the woman's pursuit of financial security.
Right, so it's like not really a genuine connection or based on affection.
Right.
It's purely a move to try to, benefit financially.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's a pretty like cutting accusation to make against someone.
Yeah.
So where did this term even come from? Like, where did it originate?
So it's interesting. It's not an ancient term. It actually only emerged in like the early 20th century.
Oh, okay.
And it seemed to have first gained traction within communities of chorus girls and sex workers.
Okay.
In those professions, financial stability could be very uncertain. And so, relationships with wealthier men offered a potential route to a more kind of like stable life.
That makes sense in that context.
Yeah. And so, the origin of the term really kind of like, says something, I think, about the economic realities that were faced by some women at that time.
For sure, yeah. So was it just like a spoken slang, or did it actually appear in writing, like early on?
It did actually appear in writing pretty early on. So we see Rex Beach used it in his 1911 book, The Ne'er-Do-Well.
Okay.
And then Virginia Brooks included it in her 1915 memoir, My Battles with Vice.
Okay.
So those are some pretty early appearances that kind of give us a snapshot of when the term was really starting to circulate.
Fascinating. So it was like present in these kind of like subcultures,
Mm.
but how did it break through into wider public use? Like, how did everyone start using it?
So I think a key moment was Avery Hopwood's 1919 play, The Gold Diggers.
Oh, wow.
And there's even a story, I think it might be apocryphal, but like the story goes that he overheard this term in conversation with Kay Laurel, who was a Ziegfeld performer. So this connection to the glamorous world of the stage most likely helped to propel the term into kind of mainstream usage.
Oh, wow. So like a direct connection to Broadway.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And it must have been a fairly new term at the time,
Yeah.
because I was reading that the producers of the play were worried that people would think the play was about actual mining,
Yeah. Exactly.
the gold rush.
Yeah, and that really kind of speaks to how novel that slang was at that time. Like how new it was.
Right.
And then if you look at some of the dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary and the Dictionary of Historical Slang from Random House,
Yeah.
and they also point out that the term was inherently gendered.
Yeah.
And that it was specifically connected to this historical context where, marriage to a wealthy man was really like the primary avenue through which a woman could kind of like achieve or maintain some kind of socioeconomic standing.
Right. So it's not just about like individual opportunism. It's about like the structure of society at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the term kind of like gains popularity, especially after this play. How did society at large begin to view this gold digger figure? Like, how did it become like a social stereotype?
So I think that you really see this stereotype starting to take hold with certain female public figures who were kind of held up as like exemplars of this trope. And a really classic example is Peggy Hopkins Joyce. So she was a former showgirl who was married and divorced multiple millionaires.
Okay.
And she was widely labeled a gold digger, especially during her very public and kind of messy divorce from Stanley Joyce in the early 1920s. And in fact, some people even think that the term might have been coined specifically to describe her.
Oh, wow.
And that she was the inspiration for Lorelei Lee in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes.
Interesting.
Yeah, so her kind of like very high profile relationships really tapped into this like, I think, deep societal unease about women leveraging relationships for financial gain, especially at a time like the early 20th century when traditional gender roles were really being questioned,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, so it was like a really public-facing case that everyone could kind of like glom onto and solidify this image in their minds. Yeah. Were there any other like prominent examples of women who were kind of like labeled in this way?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Eleanor Holm, she was an Olympic swimmer. She was dubbed the swimming gold digger during her divorce from Billy Rose, who was this big Broadway producer in the 1950s.
Okay.
And then more recently, I mean, you have like Anna Nicole Smith, who faced huge amounts of public scrutiny and was frequently kind of a gold digger for marrying the much older oil tycoon, J. Howard Marshall II. So, any woman who was in a relationship with a significantly wealthier partner, especially when there was a noticeable age gap, really became vulnerable to this label.
Yeah.
It's interesting. There was even a little blue book published way back in 1929
Wow.
called Confessions of a Gold Digger,
Okay.
which was written by Betty Van Deventer. So, it shows this early kind of like public fascination, almost like an obsession with this type of figure.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds like it wasn't just fodder for gossip columns, though.
Yeah.
This image actually started to like seep into legal discussions,
Mm.
which is something that really stood out in the material that you sent. Like, how did the gold digger become this kind of significant symbol in the legal world?
So I think that the recurring image of the gold digger in like the 1920s and the 1930s really became a potent symbol in what Sharon Thompson's research describes as a moral panic
Okay.
surrounding frivolous lawsuits. And so there was this growing public perception that women were entering into marriages really just to extract wealth through alimony and what were called breach of promise lawsuits.
So this stereotype had like real significant consequences then for women in legal settings.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So Thompson's work really kind of illustrates how this public perception negatively affected women who didn't have their own independent incomes. During alimony negotiations and in the context of prenuptial agreements, the assumption was often, well, you're just in it for the money, which could obviously severely weaken their position in legal battles.
Wow, so it's like a very concrete outcome,
Yeah.
this stereotype.
Yeah.
And this perception even kind of influenced the law itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned Hartbaum legislation.
Yes. So the gold digger stereotype really fueled public debate and outrage surrounding what was called Hartbaum legislation. And these were basically laws that allowed individuals to sue if a promise to marry was broken.
Okay.
So these are also called like breach of promise to marry cases.
Okay.
And so the fear fueled by this image of the gold digger was that women were kind of like insincerely entering into engagements with the intention of like suing for financial gain if the marriage didn't actually proceed, kind of exploiting the legal system. So this public outcry against perceived unfair alimony payouts and these frivolous lawsuits, all kind of tied to the gold digger archetype, really contributed to this a nationwide movement to actually outlaw Hartbaum legislation across the United States in the mid to late 1930s. So this cultural figure actually played a role in shaping legal reform.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's a really significant impact.
Yeah.
So like from celebrity gossip to shaping laws, it's just like shows how powerful this stereotype really was.
Yeah.
All right, so let's shift to popular culture.
Okay.
Because the gold digger has been a pretty constant presence there,
Yeah.
especially in film, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, Stephen Scher argues that the gold digger actually surpassed the vamp in popularity in 1920s cinema
Okay.
as this, like, dominant trope. And so this figure of the woman strategically seeking financial security through these relationships just really captured the imaginations of both filmmakers and audiences.
And this wasn't just an American phenomenon, was it? The term even kind of like made its way across the Atlantic to the UK.
It did, although it had kind of a bumpy landing. So there was a British remake of The Gold Diggers in the 1930s.
Okay.
And it wasn't really a critical darling, let's just put it that way.
Okay.
But despite that, there were actually several sequels made with that same title,
Oh, wow.
which kind of suggests that the underlying fascination with the concept really resonated, even if that initial adaptation didn't quite hit the mark.
Yeah, they just couldn't get it right.
Yeah.
But it was really the 1930s American films that kind of like cemented the gold digger in cinematic history, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Like, titles like Gold Diggers of 1933, Gold Diggers of 1935 were so well known.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, Film historian Roger Dooley identifies the gold digger as one of the most common recurring stereotypes in 1930s films, just kind of part of this standard cast of characters that would continually reappear.
Right.
And, in addition to those you mentioned, you also have like Babyface, Redheaded Woman, Dinner at 8, Havana Widows. I mean, it was just all over the place.
Wow. And what's interesting is like, despite the potentially like negative implications of the term,
Yeah.
these gold digger characters weren't always portrayed as villains, were they?
No, that's a really good point. In 1930s cinema, they were often actually depicted in positive and sometimes even heroic ways. So they might be presented as these like clever survivors, navigating a tough economic climate, or even as characters who ultimately like found genuine love despite their kind of like initial motivations. So it really adds a layer of complexity to the stereotype. It wasn't always just the straightforwardly negative portrayal.
Right. So it's like a more nuanced picture of this character than you would maybe think.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this character type has continued to kind of like appear in films over the decades.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, think about like Marilyn Monroe's iconic roles in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire.
Oh, yeah.
Both of those are from the 1950s, and they heavily feature characters who could be described as gold diggers, although often with a comedic or even like aspirational kind of tone.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, even in Disney's The Parent Trap in its various versions, you often see a character who's portrayed as this kind of like, the gold digging antagonist, So the trope has clearly remained relevant across different eras and genres in film.
Yeah, it's true. And it's not just film, though, like the gold digger image or like the theme even pops up quite a bit in music as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, we see in classic songs like My Heart Belongs to Daddy.
Yeah.
That was from 1938.
Oh, wow.
Diamonds Are Girl's Best Friend, 1949.
Yeah.
Santa Baby from 1953. So all of these kind of like playfully explore the idea of like material desire within relationships. And then later on, you have songs like She Got the Gold Mine, I Got the Shaft in 1982, and then Madonna's Material Girl in 1984.
Oh, yeah.
Which kind of further delved into these themes.
Right.
Yeah,
and even more contemporary music like rap, it seems like.
Yeah, so there's some research that's shown that rap music utilizes what's called the gold digger script as one of several kind of like prevalent sexual scripts that are directed at young African-American women.
Okay.
And then, of course, you have Kanye West's, massive 2005 hit Gold Digger.
Oh, yeah.
Which, was just this chart-topping phenomenon and really kind of like brought this term back into the public conversation in a very, very significant way. I mean, it was one of the best-selling and most played songs of the entire 2000s.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing how like this one term has had such like a long and diverse life in our culture.
Yeah. It really has.
It's pretty crazy. So before we wrap up, are there any like related ideas or like terms that can give us a broader perspective on this concept? Like anything else to kind of add to this whole picture?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of related terms that can offer some additional context.
Yep.
So, for instance, you have like age disparity in sexual relationships. That often comes into play.
Yeah.
And then there's hypergamy, which is this idea of like the tendency to marry someone of a higher social or economic status. And I think the gold digger label is often kind of like unfairly framed, female hypergamous behavior as being solely driven by like financial exploitation.
Right.
Right. And then, we also have the figure of the mistress. Legal concepts like separate property systems.
Right.
The phenomenon of sugar babies.
Yeah.
The impact of social stigma that's attached to certain types of relationships. The broader idea of transactional sex, the practice of treating in the dating world.
Yep.
And then the somewhat related concept of the trophy wife.
Yeah.
So all of this really kind of like touch upon different aspects of relationships where financial considerations play some kind of like notable role.
Right. They're all in this similar like world in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so to kind of like bring it all together, our deep dive shows that this term gold digger emerged in the early 20th century.
Right.
In these like specific subcultures, but then rapidly entered kind of like mainstream usage.
Right.
Significantly influenced these legal discussions around alimony and breach of promise lawsuits.
Yeah.
And it's just like endured as this powerful and evolving figure in popular culture.
Yes.
Through film and music. It's everywhere.
It's true. And it's a term that really reflects those historical socioeconomic realities, particularly for women.
Right.
And I think continues to shape how we perceive relationships where there's a notable power and balance in terms of wealth.
Right. So I guess like when we consider everything we've discussed, the historical context, its impact on the law, these various ways it's been portrayed in the media,
Yeah.
it really prompts the question, what does the enduring presence of this gold digger trope tell us about societal anxieties surrounding wealth, relationships, and gender roles?
Yeah.
Like both then and now.
Yeah.
It's clearly like a concept with deep roots that continues to spark conversation.
Yeah.
And that seems like a fair amount of judgment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah, this has been great. Really appreciate you like walking through all this with me.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. It's a really fascinating topic.
It is.
A lot to consider.
Yeah, a lot to consider. All right, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.